Hello everyone. Today I'd like to talk about a Prager University video, one titled Are Fathers Necessary?, which features the man himself, Dennis Prager, talking about the importance of fathers. Since my last video was all about masculinity, and I also talked about my relationship with my own father a bit, it made me remember this PragerU video about fatherhood that I've always thought was pretty funny. So in this video, the host, Dennis Prager, who is a religious conservative, is going to argue for what he sees as the importance of fathers from the perspective of being a religious conservative. And let's take a look at how Dennis opens his argument. He says, "For all of recorded history, the need to explain why fathers are necessary would have been regarded as, well, unnecessary. It would have been like explaining why water or air is necessary. But we live at a time in which the obvious is routinely denied." So we see here at the start that Dennis isn't just going to argue for the importance of fathers, he's going to frame his argument as a pushback against some lefty liberal PC woke narrative which supposedly denies the obvious reality of the importance of fathers. And that's a good rhetorical move from Dennis there for a few reasons. Firstly, framing his argument as a response to an opposing argument simply makes it more interesting to his audience. It's not just one point of view by itself now, it's multiple battling points of view. How exciting. Secondly, if Dennis properly establishes that opposing argument and then goes on to demonstrate how his argument is superior, it makes his own position seem stronger. And finally, as an experienced conservative political commentator who knows his audience, Dennis can play into the conservative persecution complex by making them feel under attack by all this PC wokeness around these days. So a good opening argumentative gambit from Dennis here, 5 stars. Unfortunately though, Dennis is about to make a serious misstep. You see, instead of simply alluding to the lefty liberal PC woke brigade attacking fatherhood in a general sense, he attempts to actually evidence the claim with specific examples. So let's see him try to do that.
There have been articles in the most prestigious journals denying the importance of fathers. The Atlantic magazine, for example, published an article titled, "Are Fathers Necessary? A Paternal Contribution May Not Be as Essential as We Think." The New York Times published a discussion among 5 intellectuals titled, "What Are Fathers For?" One of them, Hannah Rosen, an editor at New York Magazine, opened her response by stating, "I'm not sure whether a child needs a father." I could give dozens of such examples. I'll just give one more. HuffPost published a piece titled, "Fathers Are Not Needed."
So here we have it, 3 examples of articles in the most prestigious journals denying the importance of fatherhood. Dennis could have given dozens of examples, he says, but he handpicked these 3. These articles deny the importance of fatherhood, and that's what Dennis is going to go on to argue against. And I'm sure you're all very eager to see what Dennis goes on to say in response. However, I'm going to deny you that for a moment, try to contain your excitement for a minute, because first we're going to hit pause right here and examine these articles which supposedly deny the importance of fatherhood. And we'll start with the last of Dennis's examples there. He says, HuffPost published a piece titled, "Fathers Are Not Needed." So let's find this article. If we Google for HuffPost and "Fathers Are Not Needed," we find this article hosted on the HuffPost Life section of the HuffPost website, written by Vincent Daly, the quote, founder, publisher, and editor-in-chief of cutemonster.com. And we can notice a few things about this post right off the bat. Firstly, below the title there, we can see a note which says, "This post was published on the now closed HuffPost contributor platform. Contributors control their own work and post it freely to our site." And at the bottom of the piece, we see a note which says, "This post was originally published on cutemonster.com, which you can follow on Facebook," with links to those sites there. So this piece is someone's personal blog post that was submitted to HuffPost.com via a now defunct contributor platform. The next thing we can notice by actually reading the article is that this piece was written by a father talking about his own experiences of fatherhood. Becoming a parent can be an overwhelming experience filled with a range of emotions swinging wildly from sheer joy to deep depression, reads the first line, and the writer goes on to talk about his own feelings and experiences he had when becoming a parent. And something else we'll notice if we read this article, as well as other articles about parenting on cutemonster.com, is that this particular parenting writer makes a rhetorical distinction between being a father and being a dad. In the article on HuffPost, he talks about becoming not just a father, but a dad, and he ends the piece by asking other dads, "What's your story? How did you handle being a new father, as well as the transition to becoming a dad?" For another example from his website, we can read an article titled, "Congratulations, baby, you have a brand new dad," where he says, "It's not hyperbole to claim that the birth of my son saved me. It did. The overbearing weight on my shoulders lifted. I was no longer an expectant father. I became a dad." The author is making the distinction between being merely a father in the simple reproductive sense, and being a dad as an identity, a state of being actively engaged in the parenting process. So, fathers are not needed. What we need are dads. You get it. This article isn't saying what Dennis implies it does. He's misrepresenting this one parenting blogger's father versus dad rhetorical construction by only relaying the headline and ignoring the actual text. He's pretending this is some anti-fatherhood article when really it's anything but. It's actually a piece from a father who writes a parenting blog where he talks about the many benefits of parenthood. So okay, pretty sloppy work from Dennis there, but that is only one of his 3 examples after all. That's just one mistake. Let's not come to any conclusions just yet. Maybe he nails the next 2, who knows. So let's talk about the New York Times article. Dennis says, "The New York Times published a discussion among 5 intellectuals titled, 'What Are Fathers For?' One of them, Hannah Rosen, an editor at New York Magazine, opened her response by stating, 'I'm not sure whether a child needs a father.'" So this is the next example then. If we navigate to this discussion on the New York Times website, we can see the introduction, which prompts the question, "What is the purpose of men in modern families?" And we can see the 5 debaters on the right there. Now, the first unusual thing you might notice about these 5 debaters is that there are actually 7 of them. Dennis said there were 5, but there's actually 7. Hardy ha. Okay, so these debaters are giving their opinions on fatherhood from across the political spectrum, or at least the truncated New York Times-friendly political spectrum anyway. Conservative religious author Julie Slattery, for example, argues that a child growing up without a father is a disaster, a tragedy. Fathers provide unique benefits to children, she says, a sense of security, a specific male validation, a display of healthy authority in the home. Author and Professor Michelle Weldon counters by saying our society should not assume all children growing up without fathers are damned. Not all fathers provide security and validation, of course. Sadly, some fathers are abusive and destructive and can be a negative influence on their children's development. This is something important to remember when listening to conservatives like Dennis Prager talk about the benefits provided by fathers. For example, later in his video, Dennis will say, quote, "Fathers give both sons and daughters the thing children need most, a sense of safety and security." But do they? Always? In every case? Of course not. What Dennis is assuming there is that all these fathers are good fathers, when obviously they might not be. He's not speaking to the reality of fathers when he talks about the security they're supposed to provide. He's talking about his own platonic ideal of what a father should be. Anyway, the person Dennis decides to quote from this New York Times discussion is Hannah Rosen, who does indeed open her piece by saying she's not sure whether a child needs a father. So, here we have it then. This must be the irrational modern attack on fatherhood Dennis was concerned about. But let's indulge ourselves once again and read more than just the first sentence here, and see if this Hannah Rosen character decided to say anything else. But what I'm pretty sure about is that men need fatherhood. Uh-oh. The great tragedy of the last 30 years is how a certain segment of men have fallen off the map. A series of recessions made it hard for working class men to find work, and they haven't quite adjusted to the new college degree required workforce. I'm not sure whether a child needs a father, but fathers deeply need to be good parents, and those who can't are left further and further behind. Now then, this is a pro-fatherhood argument. Hannah Rosen chose to respond to the question by talking about the benefits of fatherhood for the fathers involved, and chose to frame the difficulties a man might have in providing for a family in economic terms, rather than some vague degradation of traditional morals or whatever. The prompt for this debate was not, is having a father good for children? It was, what are fathers for? And Hannah Rosen responded to that in a perfectly valid way by talking about the importance of fatherhood for the fathers. Dennis has again selectively quoted a pro-fatherhood piece out of context in order to imply it's anti-fatherhood. So he's 0 for 2 here on providing evidence of articles which actually deny the importance of fatherhood. But let's move on and take a look at his third example, an article in the Atlantic magazine titled, "Are Fathers Necessary? A Paternal Contribution May Not Be as Essential as We Think." And this article makes a fairly simple point, which goes as follows. People often make ominous statistical claims about the lives of children who grow up without a father in the home. For example, the article quotes a Father's Day speech by Barack Obama in which he claimed that kids who grow up without a father are 5 times as likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times as likely to drop out of school, and 20 times as likely to wind up in prison. However, there's a problem with this framing if we're attempting to figure out the impact of growing up with or without a father, and it's that the data used often only compares heterosexual couples raising children to single mothers raising children, and for our purposes, that isn't really a fair comparison, because the important thing might not be the presence of a father necessarily, but simply sufficient time, money, and resources to raise children well, and 2 people are going to find that easier than 1 person alone, regardless of their genders. A more fair comparison for the purposes of examining the impact of a father specifically would be to compare children raised by heterosexual couples with children raised by lesbian couples. And if we do that, the increased likelihoods of those negative life outcomes for children raised without a father disappear. And this makes sense, right? It's fairly obvious, isn't it? 2 people are going to have an easier time raising kids than just 1 person by themselves. And I'd hope even Dennis would admit that it would be better for a child to be raised in a home with 2 committed and loving mothers than a home with an uncaring and abusive father, right? Let's back up and ask a question here. What is this article doing in Dennis's video? You see, Dennis himself makes statistical claims which are similar to the ones discussed in the article. For instance, he says that, quote, most violent criminals grew up in fatherless homes. But he's linked under the video to this article, which contains a clear refutation to his argument. The data says it's not the gender of the parents that's important, it's having sufficient time and resources to provide quality parenting. If anyone in his audience takes the time to actually look at his sources, they'll see that not only are the 3 articles he links to not attacking fatherhood, they actually provide solid counter-arguments to a lot of Dennis's points. So why show these 3 articles? Dennis said he could have given dozens of examples, so why did he choose these 3 bad ones? And the answer is, because of the headlines, of course. If you're looking to build a straw man of anti-fatherhood in the media, which is what Dennis did, you can point to these 3 headlines and lie by omission about the contents of the articles under them, trusting your uninquisitive audience to not go and check if what you implied is actually true. This is how these 3 articles ended up in this video. Dennis Prager, or one of his PragerU minions, went on Google and specifically looked for headlines they could build a false narrative out of. We can emulate something close to what they did by going to Google ourselves, searching for "fathers are not needed," the position they wanted to argue against, and we can see that all 3 of these articles show up on the first page. I doubt Dennis has ever read any of these articles himself past what he includes in his video. Dennis's problem is that the argument he wants to put forward is that fathers are good, in a general sense. But he can't just say that by itself. He needs to frame himself as the underdog conservative pushing back against the PC liberal media. So he needs to find examples of the PC liberal media arguing that fathers are bad, in a general sense. But since he couldn't find anyone actually saying the thing he wants to argue against, he just cherry-picked some headlines and pretended. This is why attempting to actually evidence his claim at the start of the video was a mistake. If he'd just gestured to an anti-fatherhood sentiment held by a nebulous, undefined enemy, that would be difficult to prove to be false. But by claiming there's a wealth of available evidence and then so obviously failing to provide it, Dennis has proved his argument false all by himself. And he can't complain about the articles having misleading headlines because he also titles his video "Are Fathers Necessary?" the same as the Atlantic article. And this is the last thing I want to point out about this PragerU video. After posing this question and acting like the answer to it is the most obvious thing in the world, Dennis can't actually commit to saying that fathers are absolutely necessary. Because such a concrete claim would obviously be unreasonable, right? Children raised without fathers don't crumble to dust or pop out of existence, do they? Children can be raised without fathers. As Dennis himself says in his video, there is no question that many mothers have done an excellent job raising a boy without their son's father. And he approvingly quotes that same Father's Day speech by Barack Obama talking about the importance of fathers. But Barack Obama was himself raised without a father, and he went on to become the leader of his country. So, are fathers necessary? No. As Dennis himself admits in his video, no, they are not. And this is what I find funny about this particular PragerU video. Dennis goes to all this effort to craft this disingenuous anti-fatherhood media strawman, but then by attempting to seem reasonable in comparison to it, he loses the argument to it. He ends up saying that fathers aren't necessary. Dennis Prager saves the funniest undermining of his own argument for the conclusion to his video, where he says that many people have told him that they see him as a father figure. Even a man on the radio like him can fill the role of father for you, he says. And sadly, I'm sure it is probably true that for a lot of dads, what they provide to their children actually can be fully replicated by listening to some old conservative windbag podcaster, but I don't think we can really call that necessary, can we? Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. And thank you especially to all of my supporters on Patreon, some of whom should be scrolling by right now. Patrons get early access to all my videos, continuing access to a few old videos I've taken down for various reasons, and I'm very proud to say that many of my patrons have written to me to tell me they've come to see me as something of a father figure. No, that part isn't true, but the early access to videos part is true though, so if that sounds like something that would interest you, please check out the Patreon link below. Right, that's all from me today, folks. I'll see you next time.